G'day everyone. Today we're going to look at how we can incorporate things like motion blur or a sense of movement into our renders when using VRED. So this is just a bike I found on GrabCAD. I've actually had this one on my computer for a while. It's kind of textured up, and I just downloaded this quadcopter thing, whatever it is, some mini drone, which is really cool. So one of the things when we talk about motion is, well, the moving parts, right? And in most cases, the most obvious one is going to be the rotation of the wheels. So we have looked at some basic animation stuff in VRED before where we can actually rotate the wheels around. But in terms of giving that real sense of motion for renderings, we want to get a motion blur, something that looks like it's been captured by a camera, and the blur is sort of that telltale sign of the type of shutter speed that's been used, and it can start to look really cool. Like many other things when it comes to CAD modeling and rendering up, having your files set up correctly is, well, paramount. So however you set it up in whatever program you're using, whether it be Fusion, SolidWorks or something like that, bringing it into VRED keeps that assembly structure. So it can be really useful if you organize stuff into your assembly, your sub-assemblies and all that. So fortunately with this, even though some of it's in Russian and hard to understand, or whatever language that is, they have been kind enough to model up their front and rear wheels separately with their own little sub-assemblies in there of spokes and bits and pieces. So it really does work out quite well for us, because if we can see when we hide and show, it hides pretty much all the things that should be spinning. And one thing to keep an eye out for is when we go to transform this, we want our pivot point to be right in the center of it. So I think this will come up when I show how we do it on the little drone. But essentially what we're going to be doing is creating a mini animation of the wheel spinning. And right there it looks to be spinning quite fine. We're not seeing it sort of pulse in and out or anything like that. So the transform pivot point is centered. So yeah, let's get into how we can actually start to animate this. We do use the timeline, but we don't actually press play to render it. So what we have to do is, well, like we usually do, open up our curves. And this one's really simple. All we're doing is going to be changing our rotation in the X. So we've got our wheel here. When we change it, we can see that this value down here is changing. So we just want to make sure we're on frame 0, and we can set it to X for now. Click it, and we just want to make sure we key the selected channel. Then we can come across to, say, frame 50, frame 60. It doesn't really matter because we're not going to be rendering out every frame. We're just doing this for a still frame. And we render it out. We key that channel there. Then we can just come in and change the value to something like 360. So, you know, if we roll through, it does a full rotation along that axis, which is fine. So if we hit play, or maybe it's kind of hard to tell how much that's doing, but it is playing quite fast, which is fine. Now, the way this works is VRED has a built-in setting under its camera options. So VRED actually has quite a few things here that are meant to sort of simulate real cameras. So, you know, a lot of this might look familiar to you. What we want to do is enable motion blur. So when we turn that on, what it does is it simulates the shutter speed of a camera, and, you know, however that might be set. Generally, you won't notice a lot of blur, but you have to turn on anti-aliasing for it to work. And depending on your shutter speed, you can get different amounts of blur going on. Might be a bit hard to see that coming through on the video, depending on compression. So maybe we'll play around with some settings. It's looking a little more solid here. This carbon fiber section is, you know, blurring up, and you can see the little bits and pieces on it. Now you can notice we're not actually playing the animation. We don't need to play the animation at this point. It is purely just using anti-aliasing, and when you have this motion blur turned on, you can bring it down to shorter shutter speeds or faster speeds to make it be a lot more subtle. So something like that, you can see. You can play around with it. You can go as intricate as you want in terms of trying to simulate a real camera, a real photo, or however you may set that up. But that's how I go about getting that to work. So what we'll do is we can go ahead and apply this now to our little quadcopter thing, and we can see that this one's also broken down into, you know, incredible detail, but that doesn't really matter. What's important here is we can see that our transform point is set off to the side. So if we try and play around with any of these rotations, it's kind of weird. So what we have to do, a lot of times we can position, rotate, pivot in object center, and that'll bring it up to pretty much the center of mass, so the center of this bounding box. And a lot of the times that's going to work really well for us. So let's just see, we do it in Y. We can see that is a little wonky. I have a feeling this is slightly canted. Yeah, so we can see it's actually angled slightly, which isn't very good because it's not working as smooth as we want. So we can actually come down and play around with the rotational pivot. There are plenty of different ways we could do this. What we could do is isolate this and pick 2 points to pivot around. If you hold in shift, you can click a point and then a second point. Unfortunately, this doesn't actually have a center, so we can't just go through that. So what we can then do is, you know, transform that. Another thing we can look at doing is actually making sure we still have this propeller selected, but then hiding it and possibly working off this post. We can see, yeah, even that's kind of tricky, so maybe what we can do is select that and our propeller. And what we want to do is isolate these 2 objects. From here we should be able to get some sort of center. I mean, it's a little unfortunate that this doesn't always work, because we can go like center, center, and then like try and get a point down here, but this whole thing's hollow, so it doesn't always work out. We could then play around with trying to manipulate this in the object center, and okay, that seems like it might have worked just by playing around with that. Sometimes you get a bit fortunate, so no, that only applied it to that, so let's just try again. Pick 2 points for our rotational pivot, so let's just pick right next to it there and out here. And if we move it to the object center, it should keep the rotational pivot. Let's hope. No, it hasn't. Okay, so we got to play around with it a bit more. If it's in the object center, maybe just changing some of these. Unfortunately, it is very... you have to experiment with it. So perhaps having a proper side-on view will help. So from here we can actually get a lot better view of how it is rotating. And this is just part of it, right? So sometimes things work out really well and easy. Other times they take quite a bit more work. And it's not because you've CAD'd something up wrong or anything like that. It might just be it's at a slight angle. Sometimes other programs have problems with that. So I'm just trying to figure out, we want that in the center of our object. but we want to align it. Wonder if directional vector works. Probably not. So sometimes you got to play around with these and see how they actually change. So when X is at 80, it moves out that much. When X is at 40, how much does it move then? That seems like it's rotating along more. So there's all these little ways of doing that. Okay, so that's showing the axis. That's a cool way of doing it. Which might work out pretty well for us. Cool, so I've never actually seen that feature before because it's a little odd that it's doing it in such a huge line, but maybe we can work with that. That looks a little better. Let's have a look if we turn that axis off and rotate it. Still a bit of an issue. Maybe it's going off in the other way, so we'll just change our perspective back. Turn on our terrifying axis thing. Okay, for some reason now it's small, and we can see it's tilting out that way, so we got to rotate that up. Oops. So yeah, this is definitely going to be a lot of trial to get exactly right. But if you do actually have a good idea, so if it's something like you've modeled it in CAD and you know it's like 30 degrees out or whatever, then that'll probably be fine. But right now we are just going in circles here, I think. What happens if we just go... So you can get pretty precise. That seems pretty good there. Oh, that looks awful there. And okay, that's just rotating around it. So tell you what, we're just going to assume that's close enough, because we'll probably find that when we actually do go about rotating it, we're not even going to see it that much because we are playing around with blur, and it might even look cool to have the whole thing being a bit blurry. Let's hope that's a good enough excuse for not spending a couple hours figuring out exactly what angle that is, because when you do come through and do it in your CAD, it should be a lot easier. So same sort of deal. Open up our curves. We just want to make sure our object's selected, and when we play around with this rotation in the x-axis, it looks kind of right. We can see it changing there. So what we're going to do, make sure we're at frame 0 and just change our rotation to 0. It's frustrating. Sometimes this can be a bit confusing where you don't have the right thing selected, or sometimes you have to reselect it, but in this case it's not that much of a problem. So let's go there, come across to this frame down here, key it again, and we can just punch in 360. You can really punch in whatever you want. If you want it to rotate however many times a second, or if you're really trying to simulate something accurately, you could actually look up the rotational speed that a propeller operates at, and then, oh well, okay, for some reason that one's mirrored across. Never mind, let's just assume that's fine. And we can just turn on our anti-aliasing again, and now these are turning. Now, because the shutter speed is set to a certain amount, we can see it doesn't look like it's going all the way around, so we can play with those. Now, a longer shutter speed is going to give you different results. Sometimes I find having it spin around a heap of times. So if we come over down here where we've got the value of 360 and change it to like 3,600, play around with your speeds, or maybe even something less. So what do we got? Oh, sorry, that's because it's at the last frame. We have to have it on the first frame. Yeah. So playing around with these, playing around with your settings, it really is just like that kind of thing where we experiment. And like I was saying, with the center, it doesn't really seem to be, it doesn't seem to be a huge issue that it's not pivoting exactly on the correct spot, because it is blurring it out. You're not really seeing any sort of error on that. Obviously, if the center point was way off to the side, it would look crazy and silly. But right now, it actually looks fine, and it looks like it's, well, spinning and functioning properly. So, you know, we can have a look at how this one goes if we don't try and adjust the transform as much. So there we can see it is in the pretty much the center of the object. We can just fix that up by changing the rotational pivot to the center there. We should get, oh yeah, we can see it spinning the other one out there. Oops. Okay. So what we have to do on this is just do our picking of 2 points. And to select these, you can hold in Shift. And we can just go sort of from the top of that. And we can even kind of just eyeball some of these other bits, like from there to like something like the center of that. Obviously it's not perfect because there's no, you know, mark in the center, but even with something like that where it's clearly going off the center, it might not be the end of the world. And not that I'm saying you should do it like that, but a little bit of adjusting will make that look a lot better. But it doesn't need to be exactly precise for everything. We're rendering it because we want it to look good. We aren't rendering it to, you know, to show it off to a engineering panel. We're going to notice those things where it might not look right. So it is kind of just about making it look good a lot of the time. So we've made those spin. Let's turn on anti-aliasing. And you know, you can barely tell the difference between this one and this one, even though this one does wobble back and forth as it rotates. So it's not really the end of the world if it's not absolutely perfect, which is excellent because, well, we don't want to spend forever doing this kind of stuff. So one other thing I'll do here is I'll just quickly spin up this front wheel that we have on our bicycle. So we select our front wheel. We have our transform. We can see it looks like it's in the middle. Straight to our curves. See here it's still showing the scale from what was our propeller was called. So we just have to reselect front wheel. And rotation, let's just double check. It was not in the X. It was Z. So we just come here, frame 0, find our rotation Z, key it. Come to the end, key it. Now I did have the bicycle at 360 degrees, so let's just keep those two even. And as quickly as that, we can now, if we come back to frame 0, we can see that that's rotating as well. Now the thing is, it looks like, okay, cool, the wheels are moving, that's all good, but I mean, the environment's not doing anything. Now, in the case of this, where we are rendering onto an environment, we can simulate it as though the object's moving. And this is one of those things which is cool because it's an absolute lie in how any sort of physics stuff works. What we're actually going to do is transform the center of the environment in one direction. So we can see this, right? Let's just move this over here. When I move this, the center of our scene backwards and forwards, what it's doing is making the bike and, well, the quadcopter as well, move in the scene. So we can play with that. And the idea is if that moves backwards and forwards while the bike's standing still, it's going to blur the background. So let's open up our curves. We select our things. See, sometimes you gotta pick around, and right now it's not actually giving me the options here, so we might have to go and find it here, which then, of course, that's why we get that option. So we come down to transformation, and we want to play around with center Y, which is here. We can see it's the same value, -3000. Make sure we're on frame 0, key it, come forward, and then key it again. If I can figure out where I put that. Yep. It's not on the screen because it's -3000, so all we have to do is frame the curves in view. And we can play around with this one. So whatever that is, we can just go like -2500, and that's going to move it forward a bit. I don't know how blurry that's going to be, but let's just experiment, right? So we turn on anti-aliasing, and of course we got to come back to the start on frame 0. And we can see it's blurring the scene specifically in that direction. Now, right now it doesn't look like it's exactly matching, so we can go ahead and just change this value here. We can make it like really drastic and go -1500. And when we turn that on, we get a lot more emphasis on that. So yeah, that's how that can work. We can do other things here as well now. Like you can move the bike as an assembly backwards and forwards slightly as well. I have found that just by blurring that a bit, it kind of makes like everything's in motion, which is quite easy to do. So I'll just turn off anti-aliasing and select the bike. Translation, we just want to find out in which way we're going. We don't want to go side to side. We want to go backwards and forwards in the Z. Oh, okay. Apparently it doesn't like bringing the seat with it. So let's get the whole thing here. And of course our translations are different. There we go. So the translate Y on this file up here, easy enough to select that. If we just come across, we can see, yeah, object 11, translation in Y, frame 0, key that, frame 60, key that, frame it in view. And now we just want to change this slightly. So we can go, I don't know, is 50 too much? Maybe. But if we turn on anti-aliasing, come back to 0, we can start to see that now the bike is being blurred as well. It looks like it's a bit much. Obviously, we want what we're rendering in focus. So we can change it to like 20. Come back to the start here. It's a little blurry, maybe even something like 10. It's just like those little bits. It puts it slightly a bit blurry. We can then emphasize this a bit more by putting on something like depth of field, which you then have to hold in shift and select a point. And you can crank these settings up and down as well, play around with all of that. Whatever it might be. So like there's all these different ways of getting these little bits and pieces to start adding a lot of depth to your scene. So what I'm actually going to do is go to frame 60 here, and this is only going to show me the changes in the depth of field. So that's how depth of field works. It essentially shakes everything in the distance and blurs it all together. So if we come down to like 4, you can see that nothing's really happening there. On 2, we get a little bit of depth of field. So the back's really in focus and sharp, the front's looking blurry. And let's move it back. And now our whole scene's got that. There's a bit more emphasis on the front here. It really starts to get quite interesting. So like that's a bit much. Maybe you tone down the motion. Maybe you tone down the depth of field. And, you know, this even works when you go ahead and turn on ray tracing. There's something weird going on here where there's 2 floor planes showing, but it can work with ray tracing in the environment, blurring the wheels, blurring the environment backwards and forth. And we've even still got the drone up here. How's that going? And you can do things like change the environment, render it without the background. So if you don't want to play around with having to, oh yeah, so our depth of field is set to the bicycle. So we just have to come in here and we can either turn it off or set it to something like that. Sometimes the depth of field is really tricky. Oh, that's just made it a lot worse. But yeah, we can get some really cool effects to make it look like maybe our drone's in motion or the environment's in motion, whatever it is, right? I guess the reason why you would do it like this as opposed to doing it in like Photoshop, so the background part is easy enough to Photoshop in, right? But the reason you would do it like this is that you can then just come in, change the angle, get another render out, and it works, right? It works for whatever angle you want. The scene's set up to recreate this however you want. So if you decide you want a different angle on your render, you can do that. You don't have to then go in and change or re-blur all this in Photoshop or however it might be. You can go and change, the background environments, use a drop-in environment of a city street in Melbourne or something like that. So it is really quite cool to be able to set this up in our renderer and to be able to tweak these settings. Sometimes it can be faster if you know exactly what you're going for in terms of rendering something in Photoshop or whatever that might be. But in this case, I think because we're going for that shadow plane's being really sort of obnoxious at the moment. Because we're going for something that has a sort of that real feeling, we want it to sort of simulate what's going on. We can do it in here quite effectively. We can just rotate the camera to get another shot. If you've spent a lot of time working on your sort of derailleur assembly, I think that's what this thing down here is called. It's easy enough to come in. The scene's still set up. It all looks pretty professional, and you can come and just turn off your depth of field or turn off the the motion blur, and still get those really good shots down in there. You can even open up the curves and stop the rear wheel from moving or just stop the bike from moving backwards and forwards. So you can just you can just turn this straight to 0. For that, the bike won't move, the wheels are still spinning, but this is now hugely in focus, and we can get those cool shots showing off your awesome CAD skills. So that's really about it, what I wanted to cover. I mean, and look, the pedal's missing parts. I guess even just from the fact that I'm talking about you can get this effect in Photoshop as well with a bit of work. There are a lot of different ways we can do this, but the practicality of doing and setting up a scene and then being able to pick and choose whatever renders you might want, or easily changing the colors and re-rendering it, I think for me it has a lot of benefits. Hopefully it might for you. If you're sticking to Fusion and don't want to come out into something like VRED or Keyshot, I'm sure Keyshot has similar settings, and that's totally fine, but these outcomes here aren't unrealistic. It's completely achievable, which is why I'm sharing these kinds of things with you, because it's not unreasonable to think you can get some cool motion going, or your mountain bikes taking a cool jump, or your drones racing other drones. That's where the depth of field and motion blur can really work well together. When you start to get multiple elements in a scene, because you could have more drones in the background, change up the color, render it, and then maybe actually want to get the perspective of the other one, so you just move your camera there and take another render out. But anyway, I hope this has been helpful, and yeah, good luck with all your renderings for our final assignments. Yeah, thanks.